In this video, we're going to go over how to follow your bliss, and we're going to talk about intrinsic motivation, flow, and self-actualization. So this idea of how to follow your bliss was popularized through Joseph Campbell. And so he is one of the well-known Jungians of our time to present many of these ideas to the public in a popular way. So follow your bliss is essentially a way to self-actualize. So this video is really about, in the broadest strokes, self-actualization. And so what I'm going to do is go through a lot of different ideas and concepts, but I'm going to tie them all together and bring them down to a practical application so that you can actually go away and take these higher concept ideas into your everyday life and experience. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through Joseph Campbell's Follow Your Bliss. We're going to look at Carl Jung's Individuation, and that does tie into Nietzsche's Become Who You Are. And this also leads into a psychological Jungian view of the kingdom of God through Jesus's teachings in Christianity, as well as how Jung illuminates the ideas of the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, or divine bliss from alchemy, from a psychological lens. And we're going to move on to the ideas in psychology of self-actualization laid out by Maslow, the famous psychologist, and the general idea in personal development of self-actualization. And then we're going to move on to positive emotion through positive psychology, and that's going to lead us into intrinsic motivation and flow when we're dealing with motivational psychology. And so I'm going to line this all up in a particular way. And so what I want to do up front is say that I'm going to use all these ideas to convey the idea of follow your bliss and self-actualization and how they all tie together. And so these are many different topics and perspectives here. So I'm using that Nietzschean idea of perspectivism, which is when we look at things from many different perspectives. And then I'm tying in Jung's method of symbolic amplification, except I'm doing it in a way where we're looking at this subject of follow your bliss from many different ways, and we're amplifying that idea by looking at follow your bliss through many different lenses at different levels of analysis, right? And so this all plays into this idea also that I've talked about on my channel of the phenomenological reduction, in the sense that as I'm creating this video, I'm doing this meta kind of analysis or idea by tying all these ideas together. And yes, they vary in different ways. They look at things and have different presuppositions and assumptions that are made and implications from the findings. But what we find in the overlap, what we find in the middle of all these ideas is something valuable. And that's what I'm pointing at and trying to get across to you. And if you get it, if you get this overlap of ideas, what's left behind after we strip away all the inconsistencies of these ideas, what we get is this significant middle. And that's what I'm trying to lead you down, this path, this thread through these ideas that will lead you to a greater sense of meaning and understanding, which then you can take and hopefully use and apply in your own life. And so that's the purpose of this video. So we're going to look at how you can ultimately follow your bliss so that you can self-actualize. You can become and realize the potential that you have in your life. And so how I'm going to do that is I'm going to help you become more conscious of what drives your motivations, right? So when you become more conscious of that, then you can become more self-determined. You then now have more control over your destiny, over your life, so to speak, right? And so now, once you are conscious of your motivations, what is motivating you, you could now participate with your task, with your life's task of self-actualization and becoming yourself. So I'm really hoping that you can use this in your life. And that's why I've created this. And I'm actually really excited about this video because I've been thinking about these ideas for quite a while now in many different ways. And only just now have they all started to come together in this intrinsic way, which I'm going to show to you today. So let's start with the idea from Joseph Campbell about follow your bliss, or following your bliss. So I've got a quote to start us off here, open quote. This is Joseph Campbell, and he says, "You enter the forest at the darkest point where there is no path. Where there's a way or path, it is someone else's path. Each human being is a unique phenomenon. The idea is to find your own pathway to bliss." Close quote. So Joseph Campbell's follow your bliss is, his advice is to listen to that little intuition in your life where you feel that inkling of joy. And he says, grab a hold of that. And if you grab a hold of that, then doors will open for you, he says. You know, when you follow your bliss, doors will begin to open for you. There's something about that that begins to take you along this journey of your life. So where did Joseph Campbell get his idea of follow your bliss from? Well, in his video interviews, he says that he was reading the Sanskrit, which is ancient Indian writing. So this is Indian philosophy, ancient sources. And so he says there's three words, Sat, Chit, and Ananda. And so these correspond with truth, consciousness, and bliss. And he said that he didn't fully understand what it meant to, if he didn't fully understand about the idea of being or truth, full consciousness, but he said he understood what bliss was. And so he says this is the point at which we kind of the jumping off place into the transcendent, in a sense, right? And so he said if you follow your bliss, then you will be able to find wholeness or find these other things, right? And so the idea of follow your bliss is that if you follow those things that give you this blissful joy, then your life, you'll be living out your life's purpose. It's as simple as that. But where does this idea kind of come from, the background of it? And it comes from, as I said, the ancient Indian sources. And so part of that is in the Hindu Vedas, in the Bhagavad Gita. And so these are the ancient writings and the spiritual teachings of India. And so if you look at some of this, it basically says that those who renounce the fruits of their actions and submit themselves completely to the divine will arrive at the final termination of the cyclical life process, or enjoy eternal bliss in perfect union with the Godhead. So this is an understanding from ancient religious sources. And so that idea of eternal bliss or being unified with the Godhead was communicated in a lot of Carl Jung's writing. And so Carl Jung talked about this in Alchemy. There's alchemy sources, these alchemy texts, talked about similar ideas of being unified with the Godhead and entering this divine bliss. So they thought about it as these ideas of attaining the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life through these alchemical processes, and that would ultimately enable them to individuate, self-actualize, if you will, become whole, and then ultimately they were able to join in ultimate union with God. And so these were some of these ideas displayed in Jung's writings where he was highlighting the alchemical process of becoming someone, right? And so These ideas overlap, and I'm trying to show you this overlap of ideas with Follow Your Bliss, with Jung's individuation process, and that also links with Nietzsche's idea of becoming yourself, which has more of a biological slant on it. So out of yourself, there are certain drives, and you have a certain particular nature and constitution, and out of that, you become yourself, right? You are a kind of destiny. And so let's move into this Jungian idea and this idea of following your bliss that we can see in there. And so I've got a quote here from Jung, open quote. In somewhat free-handed fashion, the last two lines of Goethe's stanza are often quoted. And now this is a quote from Goethe. The highest bliss on earth shall be the joys of personality. And now this is Jung. This gives expression to the view that the ultimate aim and strongest desire of all mankind is to develop that fullness of life which is called personality, close quote. So we can see there the idea of joy or bliss is linked to this idea of wholeness of personality or the development of personality. And when Jung means the development of personality, he's talking about this process of individuation, this process of the expansion of the totality of your personality, self-actualization for short, right? And so I've got another quote here from Jung, open quote. For in every adult there lurks a child, an eternal child, something that is always becoming, is never completed, and calls for unceasing care, attention, and education. That is the part of the human personality which wants to develop and become whole, close quote. So we've got there this idea that we have an inner child that we have to nurture, this inner potential, because a child is always full of potential. They haven't quite become what they are set out to become yet. They're not an adult, they're still a child. So we all have that in us. We all have this infinite potential that is always there. And so in that sense, we never actually always quite meet this ideal, right? But we always strive towards or position ourselves or have ourselves in alignment with this idea and this ideal of moving forward towards wholeness. And so that's kind of the Jungian perspective of individuation in short, right? So I've got another quote here from Jung, open quote. The achievement of personality means nothing less than the optimum development of the whole individual human being. It is impossible to foresee the endless variety of conditions that have to be fulfilled. A whole lifetime in all its biological, social, and spiritual aspects is needed. Personality is the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being. It is an act of high courage flung in the face of life, the absolute affirmation of all that constitutes the individual, the most successful adaptation to the universal conditions of existence, coupled with the greatest possible freedom for self-determination. Close quote. So that quote there, especially at the end, is what this video is about. I'm trying to help you understand more about how you can take hold of the greatest possible freedom for self-determination. And so later on, I'm going to talk about self-determination theory, which is a theory from motivational psychology, right? And so I'm sure Jung there means it in a broader sense than what I'm going to introduce to you. And that's okay. That's why we're looking at it in all these different ways. But remember, there's that thread there. And I want to show you these ideas in self-determination theory and in other motivational theories such as intrinsic motivation that can help us in this idea of self-actualization, right? So we can have that greater freedom and have and be self-determined in our life, right? And so that's what I'm trying to achieve with this video. So just quickly here, so Jung looks at these ideas in alchemy, he looks at these ideas in Christianity to to help us understand the map of individuation, which is akin to the idea of self-actualization, right? In a basic sense. I mean, it's got its own specific nuances involving the unconscious and archetypes and stuff like that. But in a simple way, it is about self-actualization, right? And becoming whole. And so Jung does talk about using the Christian scriptures as they actually articulate this psychological process of self-actualization or individuation. And so I'm just going to read some of these ideas here just quickly, because I have read them in the past in past videos, but it's just some good context, especially if you haven't been exposed to them before. So I'm not taking these literally. These are just psychological implications of these deep religious ideas, all right? So this is Jesus. Oh no, this is just a quote from the Bible here, open quote. "For the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost," close quote. So there's this idea of joy in the Bible, right? And so joy is linked to the kingdom of God, because the kingdom of God is the domain of God, and through Jung's interpretation and the Christian mystic interpretations is that the kingdom of God is the domain of God, which is the soul, which is the domain of the soul, which is your soul, right? And so that's why in this quote I just read out, that peace and joy are the kingdom of God, right? And so there's this idea of joy linked to this inner depth of your soul, this self-actualization, this becoming and guiding through your heart, right? And so I've got another quote here, and this is from Jesus, open quote. "Until now, you have not asked the Father for anything in my name, but now ask and keep on asking, and you will receive, so that your joy may be full and complete," close quote, right? So that's amplifying that idea of joy in the Christian scriptures, right? So here's another one here, open quote. "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field," close quote. So a key aspect there is Jesus is talking about a parable about the kingdom of God, right? And we're interpreting that as the soul. And so this really is a metaphor for saying there is nothing more valuable than your soul, right? Because he sold everything he had, his material goods, all his stuff, to gain this thing that is priceless. And you see the hint there, in his joy. So there's a joyful process to this, right? To this individuation process. Okay, and here's another quote from the Bible, open quote. "If you wait at wisdom's doorway, longing to hear a word for every day, joy will break forth within you as you listen for what I'll say," close quote. So that's from the book of Proverbs, from the Old Testament. And basically, that is the idea of listening and waiting for wisdom, which is personified as a woman in the Bible. And so we're waiting for this wisdom, and if you wait for her, this joy will burst forth within you. So it's this inner contemplative process of waiting for wisdom, and it's a pathway of joy, right? And so I won't read this next quote out, but I just put this here to remind me to communicate to you that Jung talks about and quotes a lot of these alchemical texts from Alchemy, right? And so in this text here from John Portage, he basically talks about the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, and how this is linked to the idea of divine joy, right? And so this is the process of individuation, of becoming whole, of finding the higher personality, and ultimately this union with God, or in Jungian psychology, this is the union with what he calls the God image, or the self, which is the higher personality, or it is the totality of wholeness, right? And so this religious language is used to talk about this psychological and transcendental process of personality development that results in wholeness, or what we would call simply as self-actualization, right? But this is a broader, deeper, psychoanalytic depth psychology perspective on using this religious language, using this psychoanalytic language to describe this process, right? And so that's the level of analysis Jung goes into. So there's this broader idea, right? But now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and bring it into the realm of humanistic psychology through Maslow. So Abraham Maslow is famous for the idea of self-actualization, right? And so the reason why I want to now focus on this lens is this brings an interesting idea to the conversation. It brings in the idea of self-actualization, linking it to the idea of needs, right? We have different needs. So we all know, or at least I think we should all know, Maslow's famous idea of the hierarchy of needs. Now, he gets criticized a lot because when they empirically research this, they say, well, you don't really need to fulfill all these different needs from the bottom all the way to the top, right? But it's a little bit of a straw man, because Maslow did actually admit that some people don't need to fulfill all these needs, such as creative people. They somehow have a greater drive to self-actualize, and they can self-actualize before they even meet some of these base needs. And so some of these base needs are things like, when you start out, you need those very basic needs like food, water, shelter, right? And then you move on to the next set of needs, which is safety and belonging. And then the next set is something like self-esteem and different stuff like that. And then you move on to the idea of self-actualization up the top, right? And so the original idea is that you need these basic needs first before you can even contemplate self-actualizing. And when they did do empirical research on this, so they did studies on it, they did find that actually if you were very deprived, so you didn't have your basic needs at all, then like water, food and shelter, you weren't contemplating how to bliss out, right? How to follow your bliss. You were trying to get some food in your mouth, right? So there is some truth to it, but it's not so rigid. It actually depends on the individual, right? But there is some people who have their basic needs met, such as water and all this stuff, right? Shelter, but they don't have a sense of belonging, which is one of the higher needs. But they can still self-actualize. And so that's interesting. That fits into Jung's idea of individuation, where you actually need to be alone for a period of time because you break away from the herd in order to self-actualize. So some of that comes through isolation and a feeling of loneliness, right? So there's different ways to look at this, and different people experience this hierarchy of needs in different ways. So despite the empirical, back and forth with, okay, some people don't need this or that, and they do it in different ways, there's still this interesting idea of having these needs met, because sometimes it does impact on people, right? So sometimes you can't focus on self-actualizing or becoming whole or following your bliss because you're missing some fundamental need in your life, right? So if you're starving, you're not going to be blissing out, as I said before. If you don't have a sense of belonging, that might not impact some people who are very, very individualistic, but for others, that might really hit their self-esteem. They might not feel loved, and that might derail them from focusing on their individuation or their self-actualization, becoming and actualizing their full potential of who they are, or pursuing some creative endeavor to create something, right? So, but someone else, out of that sense of not belonging, they might actually have inspiration for creativity. So it impacts people in different ways. But just because it's not always true that you need to fulfill these needs before you can self-actualize, it doesn't mean that it's not important to look at this idea of needs. So that's the point, right? So now, Maslow had this other idea, which is important, which links to this idea of joy and this idea of follow your bliss. because he had the idea that those who self-actualize, they're the type of people who experience more often than common this idea of peak experiences, or a state of peak experience. And so in that state, in these peak states, they have these moments of joy and transcendence, right? And so these moments of joy and transcendence are powerful, meaningful experiences that revolutionize how they relate to their life and to the world, right? And so these peak experiences or peak states help these people become more creative out of those experiences of oneness, these experiences of creative insight. Out of that, and out of that process of joy, they are able to create things and self-actualize. They're able to participate in actualizing their potential because they now have insight into the possibilities of their potential from these peak experiences, right? And so he also says, and there is some research done that on what are the things that trigger these peak experiences, and they are things such as art, nature, or going out to nature. That's why I made that video about the psychoid archetype, right? And sex, creative work, music, psychedelics, religious experiences, and scientific discoveries. These things can trigger these peak experiences of joy and insight, right? And so there's these different aspects of these peak experiences, and it's the sense of unity of the self with others, this oneness with the environment, the experience of peak power, so this strength that comes from this positive emotion that you're experiencing. And it's not forced, it's this natural kind of thing that comes, and it's this inner self-determination. Nothing else is controlling you. You have this inner free flowing sense out of you, right? So you're not inhibited in any way. You're spontaneous, you're creative. You have this idea that you can create things without actually having to have some utility or, get something out of it. You're just doing it out of your intrinsic love and joy for it, right? And you have this sense of timelessness, this idea of individuality, right? And so these ideas, these artistic expressions come out of these peak states. This playfulness comes out of this peak state. And so these are the ideas that Maslow had around these peak states that link to self-actualizing, right? So really, Maslow was talking about follow your bliss. Really, he was, if you look closely, right? And so it's interesting to talk about this idea in regards to these needs, as I described earlier, right? Because some people, they're especially driven to express themselves creatively more than others. These are the type of people who ultimately will pursue self-actualization. And so in Jungian psychology, there's a parallel to this, that Jung basically says not everyone is made to fully individuate. Most people are, he advises, to commit to a tried and true path and be a part of the herd, because they're not really the type of people who have that inner creative drive to split off from the herd and create something of themselves by themselves, right? Maslow said a similar thing, but maybe not as in a harsh way, but he did say that different people have what's called being needs. So being, right, the idea of being needs, whereas other people have deficiency needs, right? So they are deficient in one of those things of belonging, they're deficient in shelter or feeling safe, something like that, right? Or self-esteem, and they need that in order to even contemplate self-actualization. Whereas these creative people, some of them can actually enter into that process of self-actualization, of these creative experiences of this divine joy, if you will. they can enter into that because they have more of a being need, this idea of being and existence and truth, right? They're seeking their needs met in that creative sense, in that way, right? And so that's why I think this is kind of interesting. It adds another layer that we can look through this self-actualization process, and it can help you identify, hey, where am I at right now? Who am I? How am I constituted? Am I actually missing something? Like, if I'm not feeling like I belong here, maybe that is holding me back, and that's blindsiding me from my true purpose, right? If I'm struggling financially, maybe that is hindering you, or maybe not. Maybe that is catalyzing you into this idea of freedom and creativity. So you have to find yourself, right? And your own way of relating to this process of following your bliss. But there is these unique things along the way that you can experience, these peak states of experience, right? And so this is very interesting here. So now we move on to the idea of positive emotion from positive psychology. So I've already talked about this in other videos, so I'm not going to take too much here. But basically, what positive psychology did is it builds on humanistic psychology, but it tries to make it more empirical. Empirical meaning that they just try to do more studies to verify the theories that the humanists were talking about, basically. And so positive psychology kind of goes down that vein of things, and there's some research about positive emotion. And so I've shared this before, but I'll just briefly share it again. And it's that there's this idea of the PERMA model, which is the broaden and build model, right? And from Barbara Fredrickson. And she basically talks about this model of positive emotion increases your perspective on things. And then, so what happens is then you act in a way that is more beneficial for you, which then results in more positive emotion. And then we create this upward spiral of receiving positive emotion, broadening our perspective, and acting on that positive feeling that we get, right? And so more than just some wishy-washy thing, this actually is something that I think is valuable and works, right? Because you just have to think about someone who is depressed. When you have negative emotion, you have normally a narrowing of your idea of how things should be. So you have a rigid outlook on life at that point, right? And so you end up having black and white rigid thinking when you have negative emotion, right? And so the reverse of that is when you have positive emotion, you now look at the world and you see more possibility. And that idea of seeing more possibility means now you can have hope and you can act on those possibilities and bring them into reality, into your life. That is the idea here, that you're trying to have positive emotion. Now, how do you get that positive emotion? Well, that can be done in many different ways, right? And so what they recommend in the PERMA model, which one of the elements of the PERMA model is positive emotions, right? This is set forth by the famous positive psychologist Martin Seligman, right? And so he basically talks about how you can get positive emotion from building positive relationships by doing activities that you really enjoy, and even having different experiences, right? And so part of that might be religious experiences, part of that might be experiences with a group of people where you feel validated. So there's different ways to get positive emotion, but I just wanted to bring that to you because it's this idea of well-being there. So this positive emotion, acting on it, creates more well-being, which is a broader dimension of happiness. So it's not just a fleeting happiness. It's this kind of, mature happiness that is the wellspring of your life, a basis for your personality and your life, right? So how much well-being you experience is the quality and essence of your life, really, right? And so that's what they're trying to get at there. So we're going to extend beyond just positive emotions now and deal with really what I want to show you deep down. This is what I'm really excited about and what I want to introduce to you right here. So let's get into it. So this idea I wanted to bring to you, and that I'm excited to bring to you, is the idea of intrinsic motivation. And we're going to link it also to the idea of flow. And these come from motivational psychology, right? And so the reason why I think intrinsic motivation is so important is because I feel there is this line, this thin line that leads from all these other ideas we've been talking about. Self-actualization, follow your bliss, right? And the idea of Jung's individuation links to the idea of follow your bliss, links to the idea of positive emotion, and it links to this idea of intrinsic motivation. And it's this interesting concept in motivational psychology, and I want to illuminate for you through the idea of follow your bliss, how we can take that kind of quasi-theoretical or mythological kind of idea and bring it down into this psychological concept so you can kind of see it from a new angle, and so you can kind of grab it and bring it into your life experience more easily, because you can see it as something that just plays out in your everyday life. That's what I'm trying to do here, and that's the significance of linking all these ideas together, right? So yes, we want to expand and achieve ultimate wholeness, union with the Godhead, let's say. But what does that mean in everyday life? How can we just look at it of what do I do in my life, right? So beyond kind of blissing out and, entering prayer, stuff like that, like these are things that you can do, right? Meditation, yoga practices. That's how, when we first mentioned the idea of the Indian traditions, right? The ancient Indian writing, they used things such as yoga to enter these states, right? These peak states, right? But this is just, I think, and that's all good to look at. And I think it's really interesting. I'm very interested in looking at yoga more in the future, because I've had dreams about levitation and flying and stuff like that. So, but nonetheless, I want to bring this down into something we can experience in our life and act upon, right? So that's what the goal is here. So I want to read this quote of the definition of intrinsic motivation so you can get it, right? So here's the quote, open quote. Intrinsic motivation refers to engagement in behavior that is inherently satisfying or enjoyable. Intrinsic motivation is non-instrumental in nature. That is, intrinsically motivated action is not contingent upon any outcome separable from the behavior itself. Rather, the means and end are one and the same. For example, a child may play outdoors, running, skipping, jumping, for no other reason than because it is fun and innately satisfying. Close quote. So we can see there the very specific definition of what intrinsic motivation is, right? And so it's engaging in behavior that is inherently satisfying or enjoyable. It's nothing to do with doing something for something outside of the thing itself, the behavior itself. The enjoyment is self-contained. The ends and the means are one and the same thing, right? Through your action and behavior. So notice it's always linked to a behavior. And that's why I think it's very important and very good for us to follow, because you can link it to your actual life and your everyday experience, right? And intuitively, we can understand what intrinsic motivation is, right? We kind of intuitively know what it is. But that's the technical definition of it. Now, I'm also going to read out the technical definition of extrinsic motivation, just to be clear so there's no confusion. Okay, open quote. Extrinsic motivation refers to performance of behavior that is fundamentally contingent upon the attainment of an outcome that is separable from the action itself. In other words, extrinsic motivation is instrumental in nature. It is performed in order to attain some other outcome. Close quote. So there we have that idea that extrinsic motivation is when our behavior is motivated by something outside of the behavior itself, right? So there's this separation that happens. And I think that is very interesting. We have to delve into that, and I will illuminate this for you further, right? So extrinsic motivation in self-determination theory, which is a theory put forth by Ryan and DC. These are two different researchers. Their last names are Ryan and DC. And so they put forth the idea of self-determination theory. Now remember Jung's quote in the beginning that the individuation process, or the process of the personality development of reaching wholeness, is this idea of maximizing the freedom to be self-determined, right? That's at least one aspect of that. And so this idea of self-determination theory is really interesting. And I'll get into more of it later because I don't want to get lost here with intrinsic motivation. But it plays into this because it talks about a spectrum of different intrinsic motivations. Different extrinsic motivations. So you can be completely extrinsically motivated and controlled, or you could assimilate some of it into your identity. And so it's still extrinsically motivated because you don't do it just for the enjoyment, but you're doing it because you have some values, or you believe in it, or you feel guilty. So I'll get into that later and break that down really specifically so you understand it. But I just want you to understand at this point that extrinsic motivation is on a spectrum, right? And it is juxtaposed to intrinsic motivation, which is its opposite, right? Okay. So now I want to go into breaking down this idea of extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation, and how extrinsic rewards, right? So monetary rewards, let's say, it can be different things other than money, but how money or an extrinsic reward can affect or impact intrinsic motivation. So now we're looking at the interplay between these different concepts, right? And so this is some of the original research behind the idea of intrinsic motivation, right? And behind self-determination theory in general, right? So what I believe it was Ryan and DC, definitely DC, they looked at the impact that money had on intrinsic motivation. And I'm going to break this down for you just so you get a sense of what type of things they were doing to look at this concept of intrinsic motivation. So we want to look at, when they wanted to look at these researchers, Ryan and DC, when money was used as an external reward, how did it impact intrinsic motivation, right? And what they found was that when they gave money to people to do something that they were already intrinsically motivated to do, that after the money was removed, that there was a decline in intrinsic motivation, right? And so I'll delve into it further so you understand it. And so what they also found was that verbal reinforcement, so positive feedback, increased intrinsic motivation. And we'll get into that later with self-determination theory and the concepts that underpin that. And I will equip you with those concepts so that you can understand how to apply it to your situations in life as well, right? So let's break this down here, this study done here. So there was two groups of people. I believe it was 12 participants in each group. Two groups, one is a control group and one is the experimental group, right? There's 3 sessions, an hour each, and they're working on a puzzle. They've got these participants to work on a puzzle in each session, which is across 3 days, just 1 hour each day, right? So they have these people working on a puzzle. This puzzle is actually like an interesting puzzle, apparently. And so if you're interested in what it is, it's called the Soma Cube. And so, I don't want to get bogged down into it. But there's all these different puzzles you can figure out, right? So it's the idea that this is an interesting task. Okay. And so in the first session, what they do is they just have both groups, the experimental and the control group, do the same thing. So what they're trying to do is just get an intrinsic motivational baseline. So they're just seeing how both groups, how long they participate, the timing, how long they participate in doing these tasks when the experimenter is gone, right? And so then what happens is in the second session, not in the control group, but in the experimental group, they pay them $1. They tell them just before they're about to do the task, we're going to actually pay you $1 to do this, right? And again, what they do, how they measure intrinsic motivation is they have a break time where the experimenter walks away and says, you can do whatever you want. You don't have to do the puzzle or whatever. You can do whatever you want. It's a break. And they go away and they time how long these participants spend on this puzzle. In other words, how long do they intrinsically spend on this puzzle without any direction from someone else, right? And so that's kind of how they measure intrinsic motivation. And then they also have a self-report as well. And the idea is that the self-report and the measure of the time that they spend out of their own volition doing the task during the break, where there is a correlation between those two, that there is the strong idea that that is measuring intrinsic motivation, right? And so, there's some difficulties in there, but I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds. I will provide the link in the description. You can read it for yourself. They point out, different things about that. So there's been 2 sessions so far. The first session, they just did this puzzle. The second session, only the experimental group got paid $1 to do the puzzle. Then in the third session, they just both do the puzzle without getting paid as well, just like the first time, right? And so what they found is in that third session that the people who had been paid in the second session, their intrinsic motivation goes down, and it's significant. So they actually no longer, they spend a significantly less amount of time working on the puzzles out of their own interest, in that free time, right? And so this is the very initial study that they one of the initial studies that they did. And so this is their evidence for this idea of intrinsic motivation being impacted or decreasing through giving people these extrinsic rewards, in this case, money, right? So even $1 impacted these people's interest in this task after it was taken away, right? And so the interesting idea that comes out of this, right, is this idea of the locus of causality for action. This is probably one of the most important ideas in this video, the locus of causality for action. So what they hypothesized here was that when you have an interesting task, so the task has to be inherently interesting. This puzzle was interesting for them. When they're figuring out this puzzle, it is motivating them because it's interesting in and of itself. That's intrinsic motivation. So the causality for their action comes from themselves. They want to do it because they just enjoy doing it, right? So the locus of causality of action is in themselves. Now, the idea is when they get paid that $1 to now do the puzzle, now there is a shift from that extrinsic reward given to them for the completion of that puzzle. What happens is a shift in the person's perspective of the locus of causality for action. So now the locus or the place of causality for action is not in themselves, it's not intrinsic, it's now extrinsic. Now the causality for the action is because of an external reward, you see? So that's why I've broken down this, so I can really get at this concept of the locus of causality for action, right? So that helps you understand this shift in the perception of what is causing me to perform this action, what is causing me to engage in this task of doing this puzzle. Is it because I enjoy it? Is it actually related to me, right? Because I just enjoy behaving this way and doing it? Is it out of just the intrinsic fun and enjoyment of it? Or am I only doing this because someone is paying me to do it? You see? So that's the idea there, right, in a nutshell. And so moving beyond the limitations of that one study, there's a meta-analysis done on over 100 different studies that show a little bit more nuance than that first study. But ultimately, it does show a similar thing. And it shows that when extrinsic rewards, so money or something like that, or something equivalent, are expected and tangible, they undermine intrinsic motivation, right? And so what they found here is when it's expected and tangible, they're the key things from the empirical research that they found, right? So expected means that before they were going to do the task, they were told they would receive an extrinsic reward, right? So if they were told they're going to receive money to do this before they did the task, then it's expected. If they did the task out of enjoyment and fun, intrinsic motivation, and then they were just randomly given money, like just as a bonus, just add on, like, oh yeah, you also get this money for doing it, right? It didn't impact it as much because the task itself was still completed through that locus of causality of action that links to the identity of the person, that links to the person doing it out of just enjoyment, right? They didn't do the task for the money. The money just came randomly as a byproduct afterwards. That doesn't impact on intrinsic motivation. But if the money is expected up front, then that does impact on intrinsic motivation. It declines, it results in a decline of intrinsic motivation, and also tangible. So I think it has to be tangible, has to be something that you actually perceive as real. It can't just be something, oh, I don't even know if that is, really doing something for me. Okay, cash in the hand is actually doing something for me. Like money in the bank is doing something for me, right? So it has to be actually tangible. It can't be some thing that's not believable, right? Or too abstract, right? Okay, so that's the idea there in a nutshell. So the main reason for the undermining of, the main reason that extrinsic rewards undermine intrinsic motivation is because the shift in the individual's reasons for performing the behavior from internal, from interest and fun, to external, to receiving the reward, right? So changing the source of the motivation and changing the locus of causality for action is what matters, right? And so this insight is powerful because now you can look at situations and understand if you are operating out of the locus of causality for my action is coming from me intrinsically or is coming from pressure from the environment, right? And so that helps us understand the source of our motivation, right? And so if you get a handle on this, you'll be able to become conscious of what's motivating you, and you will better understand why you enjoy something or don't, because intrinsic motivation comes with the added benefit that you actually enjoy it more, right? And that you're more persistent at it, and it actually results in better and deeper learning, right? So you're not just learning so you can pass a test, you're learning because you love learning. you love the topic you're learning about. You process that information in more depth. You get more out of it. The life is more fulfilling. The actions are more fulfilling because the quality of it is linked to inherent enjoyment and satisfaction in and of the behavior itself. And so if we step back a little bit and look at that phenomenologically through the sense that this is our actual experience, the meaning itself is right there in your experience. Intrinsic motivation gives us access to joy through our behavior inherently. I'm trying to help you see how to link these ideas together and grab the golden nugget from the middle of all this. You can actually live out a joyful life through intrinsically enjoying the actions in your everyday experience, right? That's the power of intrinsic motivation. And so also there's research, right, done on positive emotions and rewards, extrinsic rewards. And so it hasn't got the most empirical evidence, but there is theories in the idea of neuroanatomy that suggest that positive emotions and reward incentives or extrinsic rewards depend on a common neuroanatomy, right? And so that's why there might be this interference, because they share this common neuroanatomy, which they both may increase midbrain dopaminergic activity, right, in the ventral tegmental area, right, a specific part of the brain. Now, so that's really interesting. That is really, really interesting, right? So, but that is still speculative, but it's still an interesting theory nonetheless, all right, with that brain stuff, that they share the same mechanisms, and that's why they impact on each other. And now that might be interesting to segue into this next idea, because I want to layer this for you deep. I want to bring you back into this in a fresh and new way, right? I want to link this back to the mythology in some way. So looking back through this at a psychological lens and looking back at the idea of where is your locus of causality for action, right? I've got this quote from Jesus that I've quoted in another video, which I highly suggest you go and watch. It's called, on my channel, Jung's Deeper Meaning of Introversion, all right? And so I highly recommend that video. I'll link it in the description because it's that important. And I'll put some other links to the other important videos that link to this whole entire video, this concept of self-actualization. All right, so let's get into this quote here that I believe shows, Jesus talking about the locus of causality for action. Oh, that's interesting, all right? Motivational Jesus coming out here. So let me read this quote from Jesus. Open quote. "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Close quote. Oh, do you feel that? That is amazing, right? So I'm not reducing that down to just this lens of psychology that we're talking about right now, and positive psychology and motivational psychology. But if we just look at it through this lens for a moment, we can see it in a new way. And that's what I'm about, the amplification of this archetypal experience that Jesus talks about. Because Jung talks about how Jesus, why his words are so powerful is because he's talking about the archetypal structure of our psyche, but essentially, right? And so I'm not reducing this down to these insights. I'm just looking through different lenses to magnify it so we can see it in new and interesting ways, right? And so, and I'm doing this for my own purposes so we can see how it links to this idea of follow your bliss, right? And so, because, Joseph Campbell is talking about all these different hero myths and the idea of mythology and all these things. So I'm linking it all together here. All right. So let's just have a little fun here then, shall we? So if Jesus was a motivational psychologist, he might have said, you can't have multiple loci of causality for your actions. You cannot serve both intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. You see, so now that's interesting, right? Because Jesus said you cannot serve both God and money. Now, in the Jungian idea of God, God is deep within you. The kingdom of God is the domain of God, which is the domain of the soul. It's within you, right? So God is the deep aspect inside of you. And so that would align with intrinsic motivation. I'm motivated by the joy inside of me. Oh, the kingdom of God is not meat nor drink, but righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Ghost. So you can't serve both God and money. Money is external to you, right? Extrinsic motivation. They even use money for the extrinsic rewards in these experiments. So I'm not reducing it down to this, but I'm just saying this is an interesting way to revivify this idea of Jesus's, the archetypal idea, and then bring it into your experience. You see? That's the idea of the amplification of these symbols. That's the idea of the phenomenological reduction, where we come down to the overlap of these ideas and we see the significance or the golden nugget in the middle, the thread that we're pulling out, that we can pull out the meaning into our lives. And now it's right at your fingertips. Now you understand. I can follow my interests, and that is following my bliss. That is the pathway of God in a sense. You see? The divine kingdom, the divine joy, you see? Not just in Christianity, but it's conveyed in, the Indian religions. It's conveyed in alchemy. It's conveyed in all these different ways. Now it's in this, motivational psychology. So I just thought this was very interesting, and it helps us get a hold of it in a very interesting way. And so let's sum up this point with this next quote from Jesus. Open quote, "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" Close quote. Oh, I love that quote. And I've been living by that quote for a long time because I've been living my own kind of way, not letting other people take my soul. But let's link this back to the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. See, so what happened was in that experiment, when they were extrinsically given a reward, when the locus of their action, the locus of causality for the action shifted to being only for the reward, extrinsically motivated, you could say that is a loss of soul. And that's why now in the next session, in the third session, when they did the task again without getting paid, that sense of intrinsic enjoyment was lost. So there was a loss of soul, right? So we can see this in our everyday experience of when we do different things in our lives. Are we doing it out of our enjoyment, out of ourselves and our heart? Or are we doing it for some external reason? And if we do things consistently for external reasons, we will experience what's called a loss of soul. We will be doing something not because we enjoy it, because we want to do it. We'll be doing something because we're demanded from the outside that we do it. And that's fundamentally the principle that Jesus is talking about here. But obviously he's talking about it in even a much more deeper way than just that. But I'm trying to bring it back down into your experience. And so I find that very interesting because it says there, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world? So even, let alone $1 to do a puzzle, even the whole world is not worth losing your soul, right? And so there's this exchange between external, you being given something from the external world, this exchange between that and your soul. And so I just find that fascinating, honestly. Meditate on that for a while. That's worth meditating on for years, to be honest. All right, so now let's move on a little bit here. I'll follow up with a counterpoint to the point I just made. Then we're going to move on in a dramatic fashion to through this intrinsic motivation stuff a little bit more so you can implement it into your life even more, right? So a counterbalance to this is I actually had a dream that I want to share with you. And to summarize the dream, a preacher appeared in my dream. So, a preacher, someone who preaches the word of God, right? They appeared in my dream and they said, pray against anything that says money is evil, right? And so how interesting is that? Pray against anything that says money is evil. What the hell? And so I actually find that really interesting because that is the function of the counter function, right? It's the reconciliation of opposites. It's a counterbalance to ensure that I don't spiritualize everything, right? Because you can have a tendency to spiritualize all this stuff and then you just neglect the world, you bliss out, baby, and then you're just not related to anything in actuality, right? And so that can be horrible. So I believe this dream is counterbalancing the idea. So I don't see money as inherently evil, right? And so I think that is very interesting, right? So, and it even gave me emotionally that sense of balance, right? So, and so in a future video, I might actually talk about the reconciliation of opposites because I've had these dreams and these experiences in many different ways, more than just this. And so that's a part of individuation I think is so important. And the reconciliation of opposites is also conveyed in Nietzsche's idea of the Superman or the Übermensch. And so, and in Jungian individuation. And so it's an important idea, but it's a little bit out of the scope of this video. So we're focusing on this idea of bliss and joy here, but I wanted to put that in there just to put the counterbalance in, right? So there is this counterbalance. Now, what's interesting is this links to research in motivational psychology, in the field of motivational psychology. Despite what I said earlier, that research is good, right? What I said earlier about the extrinsic rewards do undermine intrinsic motivation. However, there is some research that shows that there is a kind of optimal balance that can be obtained. Now, it's beyond this video to go into all the intricacies of that, but I put this forth to you so you understand that idea of reconciling the opposites to balance this. There is a way where there is some research that shows in a delicate, complex relationship, there is a way to be both intrinsically and extrinsically motivated. And that actually, when you are able to fulfill both in a specific kind of way, it actually is even more powerful, right? Because you got both working for you. Now, that is a more in the weeds type of discussion, but I wanted to bring that to you so that you can understand the full range of these ideas, right? So I don't want to give you some off-center view of this, so you're taking it in the wrong way, right? So, but I also didn't want to obscure things, so we're not going to go down into the weeds of that. But there is a way that you can actually basically receive money and still be very intrinsically motivated to do something. And see, a lot of that has to do with the locus of control, the locus of the causality for your action, right? And your identity and your relationship to the task and your relationship with the money in general, right? And so that's a complex relationship there, right? And you can think about that yourself in your own life too, right? And because remember, these are all kind of based on statistics, these research, like the average person statistical significance. But when these things apply to your specific life, when you reflect on your immediate experience, that's when these ideas are the most significant and powerful. So you have to actually do some thinking and think about how they apply in your life. Think about how you feel about different forms of motivation, how you feel about the locus of causation for your actions. What is actually dictating your actions? What is guiding it? Your intrinsic motivation, or is something from outside controlling you, right? You have to think about that. And in what combination does that work for you or not work for you? You have to think about that. That will open up things for you, for your specific situation, right? Okay, so now going back to this idea of following intrinsic motivation, following God, the inner law, right? Let me bring in these Jungian quotes here. Open quote. Yet the development of personality means more than just the fear of hatching forth monsters or of isolation. It also means fidelity to the law of one's own being. Fidelity to the law of one's own being is a trust in this law, a loyal perseverance and confident hope, in short, an attitude such as a religious man should have towards God, close quote. So that is Jung talking about the development of personality and how this process happens through fidelity to the law of one's own being. That's how he talks about it. So it's like you have this inner law that you have to follow in order to self-actualize, right? And for Joseph Campbell, it was follow your bliss. That was the law, right? And so let's read this other quote to fill this idea out a little bit more. And this is from Jung, open quote. It is what is commonly called vocation, an irrational factor that destines a man to emancipate himself from the herd and from its well-worn paths. True personality is always a vocation and puts its trust in it as in God, despite its being, as the ordinary man would say, only a personal feeling, close quote. So there we get a different side of this picture of following one's own inner law. And now it's conveyed in the idea of vocation or a calling that one undergoes and follows as a kind of destiny that they have, right? And so this is what you have to do. You have to find your inner law. You have to find your vocation, right? And you have to trust in it as you were trusting in God, right? Because that's depth psychology, right? The psychoanalytic view of this. Like I said before, that's why I mentioned those ideas from Jesus, right? And so you can only follow, you can only serve God or money, right? And so in this case, there's also this idea of breaking away from the herd or its worn paths, right? So in Jungian psychology, to individuate, you have to become an individual. You have to pull yourself out of the identity from other people, right? And you have to go your own way. And then he says, and people say, oh, that they'll ridicule you. They'll say, oh, it's only a personal feeling, is what Jung said there, right? The ordinary man will say, basically, that's only a personal feeling that you have. Now, why that's so interesting is that links to this idea of following God, intrinsic motivation. It's just a personal feeling. Why do you enjoy that? Why you enjoy that? It's nothing. See how what we've done in our society and culture. This is what we've done, man. It's a big problem, and I'm going to talk about this in future videos. This is the problem of the world. The problem of the world is lost its soul, right? It's lost enjoyment. People have hollowed out their lives because everyone is now living their life for external reasons. That's why. It's powerful, man. It's powerful. And it's not absolutely everyone, but it's such a common thread and trend that people are living basically for some thing in the future that will never actually even actualize. Like a lot of people, they live for their retirement, for example. Now, I'm not saying being stupid and don't put some money away from retirement. That's a smart thing. But in general, when your whole disposition and life is like just every day I work so I can pay off my house, and it's all just about that mechanical thing. Like, I don't know if you've met people like this, but I have people in my family like this. I have people, friends, I've seen people out there like this, right? It seems to be a very common thing. People do things instrumentally, in other words, right? Extrinsically, they're completely extrinsically motivated, in other words. And what that does is it hollows out all the joy. You'll see that they're actually stressed. They actually aren't getting their needs met, right? Because they're not really self-actualizing. They're experiencing what Jesus called, of that loss of soul, right? Lose your own soul. That is basically the world's problem in a nutshell. And I'll flesh that out more, but that's why I believe these ideas are so important. It's not just this idea of self-actualization, or this spooky idea of individuation, I'm lost in my dreams. Like, it literally is about bringing the meaning back into your experience. And I'm trying to tie it down into these psychological concepts so it's right at your hand so you can engage in it and act upon it. That's what I want for you, because I want you to actually be able to experience it. And I've been experiencing it more, and it is hard to do all the time. I'm not saying you have to be like, every second of your life is like blissful or something, but I'm trying to give you access into how do you take these ideas, these seemingly mystical ideas and the mythology down into the experience, right? And so Jung says there, it's a personal feeling. And so we have to get back to this intrinsic motivation, right? Because the meaning of it is inherently meaningful and joyful to do, right? And if you can get money as a byproduct, it doesn't affect the intrinsic motivation, which is empirically what they found, right? And so that's the magic. So let's move on here. So intrinsic motivation, and let me help you now really get into it. Okay, so if I haven't already helped you get into it, let's go even deeper by looking at psychological needs. So this is a little bit of an extension from the idea of intrinsic motivation. So just thinking on or reflecting on the idea of intrinsic motivation leads to this idea for the need for autonomy, right? Because if extrinsic motivation comes about when outside force is motivating you to do something, that would mean that in order for you to experience intrinsic motivation, you would actually need autonomy. You would need freedom from outside forces, from people trying to control you, essentially, right? So that's when this stuff gets interesting. Right? The need for autonomy is put forth by Ryan and DC as they put forth the idea, the theory is called self-determination theory. And self-determination theory says that we have 3 different psychological needs. So as I mentioned, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can understand we all have physiological needs. We all need water, which I'm actually quite thirsty right now. This video is longer than I thought, but it's okay. I hope it's still adding value to you. But we need water. We need food. We need sleep. We need, warmth. We have a need for sex, right? So we have these more biological, primal needs, and we all agree on that. We agree we have these needs. Without them, without water, you'll die, right? Without air, you'll die. So, but what they put forth in self-determination theory is we have these psychological needs, and the 3 psychological needs they argue that we need is the need for autonomy, the need for competency, to feel competent, and the need for relatedness, to have a sense of belonging with other people, right? And so let's go through these. So if you can get a hold of these three needs, what you can do is you can understand what motivates you more, and you can begin to create environments and situations that meet these needs that will then sustain your motivation, right? And you'll be more intrinsically motivated as opposed to being forced from the outside, right? Because your needs are getting met, you are intrinsically motivated to meet these needs. That's the kind of theory in a nutshell, right? And so there's this link here to begin with intrinsic motivation and the need for autonomy, which I outlined. So intrinsic motivation is an inherent motivational tendency that has evolved, which is this idea, because it entails many adaptive advantages. So the idea is that the reason why we're intrinsically motivated is because it actually provided some evolutionary advantage that helps us to adapt to our environment. It's something like that. So I don't want to delve deep into those weeds, but I find that point very interesting, and that's touching on something. And how Ryan and DC made up these, discovered these ideas for the need for autonomy, it does link back down to these kind of more these idea of an organism. So it basically has this idea that an organism needs to be autonomous. And so I haven't completely explored the roots of those ideas, but it's very interesting, right? Because these needs aren't just plucked out of thin air. They're built on, basically the idea that we are living beings and we're organisms, that we evolved, right? So it's built on that line of thought, which I find very interesting. And so the need for autonomy comes from that, right? And I think that is interesting. Just think in general, I came out of my mother, but I'm a distinct being from my mother. I am not my mother. And so I need autonomy. Psychologically, I have my own kind of mind, and I am different from my mother. And so as an organism that is distinct from others, and I have my own sense of self, I have this need for autonomy to operate of my own volition, right? So it kind of makes sense through that imagery there, right? But so that's where it kind of comes from, right? These three needs. And, it's pretty obvious that we need to relate to others. That increases our sense of well-being and increases the likelihood we're going to come back somewhere. There's nothing worse than going to somewhere it's like, I didn't get along with anyone. I didn't feel like I related to anyone. I'm not going back there ever. That's not going to motivate you to go anywhere. But you go somewhere and you feel like, wow, I feel so related here. I feel so connected. Yeah, I'm coming back here. You see, so it motivates your behavior because your needs are getting met, but it's something intrinsic in the environment, right? And so, and the need for competence is we often love doing things we feel good at, right? Oh, I'm competent at this. I like doing it. It makes me feel good. It boosts my self-esteem, my sense of identity, right? When we find something that says we're not competent, that we're useless, right? We feel bad. We get demotivated. We don't want to go there. We don't want to be someone who's useless. We want to be competent. We want to be someone who is effective in the world, right? Because that gives us power, so to speak, right? And it gives us power to act and do things. And so that's why it's linked to motivation. It increases our inherent motivation. And so they're the three needs: the need for autonomy, the need for competence, and the need for relatedness. These are psychological needs that link to intrinsic motivation, but they also link to the theory of self-determination, right? And so these needs are things that we can work upon in order to become more self-determined. And so if we are doing a task now that is not intrinsically motivating, so it's not really that interesting, then we have a problem, right? So what do we do? What do we do, right? We still need to do things sometimes that we're not intrinsically motivated to do, right? And so this is where the idea of self-determination theory comes in. And it basically says there are 4 different types of extrinsic motivation, right? So external motivation. And so it's a spectrum, like I talked about at the very beginning. And what happens is it starts from being completely extrinsically motivated. So it's called external motivation. And the only way we do something that is completely externally motivated is if we are given a reward or a punishment. So we're only doing it for the reward. I'm only doing it for the money, man. That's all. I don't even care about it. I just need the money. That's why I'm doing it, right? Oh, I'm only doing it. I'm going to get in trouble. I don't really want to do it, but I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to do it, right? That is an example of external motivation, right? And so that's far out on the spectrum, right? And so it's this idea of, then there's this idea going up the spectrum, is that this idea of internalization or integration. And so what it is it's integrating the behavior or actions or tasks that you're doing into your identity. So when I say I'm only doing it for the money, that means my identity, I'm not linked to this behavior I'm going to do. I don't care about it. I don't care about it in and of itself. It has no intrinsic value to me. I'm only doing it because of something else, because of something outside of the behavior, because I want that money. So I'm instrumentally motivated to get that money, right? So it's a pragmatic way of thinking. Now, if I've integrated this a little bit into my identity, right? So I've undergone the process of internalization a little bit. Now we move from completely external regulation of motivation to what's called introjected regulation of motivation, which is, it's somewhat external. So it's basically, I only do something for self-esteem reasons or because I'm guilty. So it's like, I don't really want to do this, but I feel guilty, so I'm going to do it, right? Like, so I don't really want to help this person out. It doesn't intrinsically motivate me. It doesn't give me joy, but I feel guilty because I feel this sense that they're a person and, we kind of went out here and I feel guilty that I didn't do something for them. So there's a little bit of the identity in there because you feel enough to feel guilty about it, right? So if you're driven by guilt as a motivator, that's the level that you're at of extrinsic motivation, right? And so that probably comes in with a little bit of relatedness. So you feel a little bit connected to someone, but you don't really care to do the task, but you still getting that need met of relatedness. So you feel a bit guilty, right? So that's that level, right? Now we move up a little bit, more internalization of whatever behavior you're doing, right? And this is called identified regulation. So now this is somewhat internal. Now you've internalized this a little bit more, right? And what you've done is you consciously value these as something that is good to do, right? So you're not guilty. You're not saying, oh, I'm only doing it because I'm guilty. You're saying, no, it's a good thing to do, right? Like, it's like, I don't really want to do it like 100%, but it is a good thing to do. So I kind of want to do it as well, right? That's what it is, right? So you identify with it. It's more of your identity. Yeah, that's a good thing to do. Let's go and do that, right? So there's a motivation there that it's good to do, right? Because it's actually a part of your goals or something you value, right? And so now we move on a little bit more and we move to the completely what's called integrated regulation of extrinsic motivation. So it's not something that you completely enjoy intrinsically just of itself, but it's something that is so assimilated into your identity that you fully value it, right? Like it's an intrinsic part of your identity and you value doing it. Now, when that happens, you are getting your needs met, right? So you feel autonomy, you feel competent, you feel related, and you're living out your values, and you are motivated to do it because it's a part of your identity at this point, right? You've internalized this extrinsic behavior. That is the process of internalization of extrinsic motivation. So if you're not intrinsically motivated, you can use those basic psychological needs of relatedness, competence, and autonomy to internalize the extrinsic motivation. So it actually becomes part of your identity. So in other words, if you get your needs met, so if you feel related, if you feel competent, if you feel autonomy, then and you perceive that as related to these tasks, your locus of causation of the action will allow you to see this as a part of this action as a part of your identity, right? Even if it's not inherently interesting to you. So I think this is powerful for you to take away and use in your life if you understand that the environment, different environments meet your certain needs, and that is what's motivating you to perform those behaviors consistently. Then now you can begin to shift your environment and your own relationship with yourself and the environment and with other people to meet these needs to continue to motivate you, right? So let's just go over them briefly again. So relatedness, right, is enhanced specifically through receiving respect, care, or feeling like you're in an inclusive environment or a sense of security, right? And it's undermined by competition, criticism, and like these little cliquey traditions and stuff where you don't feel a part of it, right? So use that information to enhance your ability to fulfill the need for relatedness in different environments, right? So if you feel respected and cared and connected, you're going to feel that need for relatedness. Now, you might not have all of these, right? But you have at least some of these in operation, right? Competence is the next one. So competence is enhanced through an optimal challenge or positive performance on a feedback, right? So when someone gives you positive encouragement that what you've done or feedback of what you've done is good, you actually feel more competent about it, right? So you have to, that has to be a part of your experience for you to meet this need so that you continue to be motivated to do something, right? And so it's undermined through something that's too excessive, like a challenge that's way too difficult, or through negative performance fit. So people giving you negative feedback will tell you that you're not competent enough, and that will demotivate you, right? Okay, and now the last one is autonomy. So how do you get a sense of autonomy to meet your needs for autonomy? Well, it is enhanced through having more choice or the perception of choice. So if you perceive you have choice, you feel like you are choosing what you want to do. You have autonomy. You have the power over that choice, right? And so also explanation or rationale. So when something is actually explained why we're doing it, it's not like it's just thrusted or forced upon you. It actually makes sense. And then you go, yeah, that explanation makes sense. It's reasonable. I agree with that. I am out of my own autonomy and volition going along with this because it makes sense. You know, so that's the whole idea. When you explain something to someone, or if someone explains something to you and they actually give you a rationale for why we're doing something, then your autonomous being can connect with that because it makes actual sense of why we're doing it. And so the things that undermine your autonomy are tangible rewards, threats, deadlines, imposed goals, or control. So anything that controls you from outside of yourself will undermine your sense of your perceived autonomy. And that will then undermine your motivation. So the powerful thing here, and what I've decided to do is I'll link this image that I have here in the description because I think it's copyrighted, so I can't actually put it in this video, but I'll leave a link there in the description, and it will be self-determination theory. So if you go there in the description, you'll be able to find it there, and you'll be able to see a visual image of these concepts, right? And so if you fulfill your psychological needs, then you can motivate yourself, right? And so any environment that meets these needs will motivate you, right? And you can use these to motivate other people, right? And a good thing about it is it's the type of motivation that links to this idea of, it's the idea of intrinsic motivation. It's that idea that I'm doing things out of my own will and out of my own choice, right? And so it's a different ethos, it's a different paradigm to some of the other motivational ideas out there, right? And so this is really what I want you to grab hold of and think about it yourself. Don't just rely on this image. Don't just rely on what I've said, but think about these ideas of the need for relatedness, competence, autonomy. Think about them in your own life when you do tasks and what motivates you to do certain things. And also think of the idea of intrinsic motivation. What do you find inherently enjoyable? You know, because what I'm trying to get you to do is live a life that is actually fulfilled and motivated, because that's how you self-actualize. That's how you actually go and get stuff done, but get stuff done with a full personality, right? So you're not doing things just because of some external reason to yourself, your identity, and to your behavior, right? You're not doing things for something external to that. You're doing things because they're in alignment with who you are, they're in alignment with your behavior, and you receive intrinsic meaning and significance out of your direct actions because your psychological needs are being met and you feel alive, you feel motivated to do things. That is what I'm trying to outline for you here today, but you have to reflect on these concepts and apply them in your own life, in your specific situations throughout life, in every area of when you're doing things, right? Because that's what the idea of motivation is. It's when I do a certain task, you know. And so this theory, actually, self-determination theory, is known as a content-free theory, which actually means it can be applied to many different situations. It's not something that tells you exactly what to do. It's something that has these underlying principles that if you use and understand your particular relationship to these things, then, and to the tasks that you're doing, and to your own sense of identity, right? And to that idea of locus of causation of action, right? So in other words, are you determining what you're doing, or is some outside force determining what you're doing, right? And so I'm trying to give you the soul back to life. That's kind of my mission here. And that's my mission for my own life too. You want to live in a way where you actually feel good about what you're doing, right? That's the ideal state. Now, I'm not saying we always live in that state, so don't feel guilty if you're not always feeling that way. But with these principles, hopefully we can move more towards this way of being, so we can experience that sense of wholeness. We can experience that sense of connectedness to the actual tasks and behaviors that we're doing and living out in our lives, right? That's where the significance and meaning is. It actually is right at hand in doing what we're doing. It's intrinsically there, and the joy is there for the taking. And so I want to briefly mention, before we move on to the idea of flow, right, and ending it with self-actualization and tying it together and finishing it off, I want to let you know that this self-determination theory and the idea of intrinsic motivation and the research I've been showing you through Ryan and DC, these things are in distinction to, or kind of in opposition in a certain sense, to the ideas of motivation that rely purely on external motivation or I guess control or force or manipulation in a sense. And so those ideas they come from the behavioralists, from behavioral psychology, which I think and want to say to you is highly valuable to learn. It's very powerful. Behavioral psychology is not nothing. It is actually very powerful when you learn about it, because particularly the idea of classical conditioning, but particularly operant conditioning, that's very important to learn about. I'm not going to go into it in great detail here because it's beyond the scope of this video. I want to focus on the following your bliss, but I need to put this in here to counterbalance some of the stuff I've said, so you know there's broader debates and things happening in this field, right? And in the field of psychology in general. And there's also opportunity for you to learn more about these other ideas, which are also very powerful. So operant conditioning basically works through encouraging repeated behavior through using rewards or incentives, and through using punishment, right? And so what they teach you is how to create what's called a reinforcement schedule, right? And so a lot of governments and businesses and organizations use these principles to basically control people, right? And so that's why you get paid to do certain work, right? Because they want to externally motivate you. They want you to do something you don't want to do. So they will incentivize you to do something that they want you to do. Whoever is using these principles in any given situation throughout society, right? So I bring it to your attention so you're more aware, because part of this video is about making you more aware of what's motivating you. And you need to understand that rewards, incentives, and punishments and stuff like that can influence your life and are influencing your life, right? And so it's very important to look up operant conditioning and research that a little bit, because there's different types of rewards and different types of incentives, right? And so you need to look into that, okay? So I'm not going to say more about it, just to say that it is really powerful, and I loved actually learning about it, and so it's good for your own sake, so you can understand what's going on out there, but also you can understand for yourself, because sometimes this can tie into self-determination theory and stuff. Like, as I said before, sometimes external rewards can work with intrinsic motivation, but it's that's a more complex topic that's beyond the scope of this. So, but I introduce that to you so you don't get a lopsided view of these ideas, right? And so let's move on now to flow and intrinsic motivation and peak states and performance, right? So the idea of flow is kind of an extension of intrinsic motivation, but it also implies and goes to the idea of peak states and performance. So flow is a state, flow state, or being in the zone, right? But it relates also to performance, and the underbelly of flow is really involves skill and challenge. So it's about a challenge. And the reason I bring into this conversation of the idea of follow your bliss is that ideally you want to be able to enter into these peak states, which is basically those states that Maslow predicted, these peak states or these insights. But when we talk about it in the sense of flow, it's also talked about in the idea of performance or self-actualizing, right? And so we want to enter these states because these are the states that we enter when we're kind of at the peak of our field. So when we are actually self-actualizing, we experience flow, right? And that's why I think it's interesting. Now, I think self-actualization is a larger concept than flow, especially when we add all the psychodynamic and depth psychology stuff to it. But if we just look at the idea of you're in the moment right now, you will always be in the moment right now. You're always here conscious of something. And if you're doing something, what are you doing and what's the significance of that? And flow is a significant state of operation or being or experience that when you're in it, your skill level is optimized and meeting the demands of a challenge that is optimized for your skill level. So they are on par with each other. So you enter flow when you have a high skill level and you have a high challenge that your skill set can meet, right? And when you're in that process of your skills meeting and arising to the occasion of a challenge that is worthy of your skill set, you experience these peak states, right? And this is, I think, a good way to look at how to practically work towards understanding the idea of the immediate experience of self-actualization. Instead of it just being a concept or some identity outside of yourself somewhere floating around, this is an experience you can actually have and enter into, the flow state. And so that's why I bring it up here. And it's interesting because there is some research and some ideas floating around that says that it's harder for some people to enter the idea of flow, and not everyone can enter into it as easy as other people. And some people enter into it really well. And you see there's a trend here. You go back and you look at Maslow. Or some people like to self-actualize, but there's actually these creative people who self-actualize more often than others, and they kind of jump up there and they're always self-actualizing. Or we look at Jung's psychology. Oh yeah, some people individuate. We all individuate, go under this universal process. Oh, but for some, they should actually just follow the herd and, do that. And only some people should break away and do their own thing and be creative and foster this idea of wholeness and become a true individual. You see, so it's this idea is found in all these different things, and you add it all together. And even the idea of intrinsic motivation. I think I even read something that some people are more intrinsically motivated than others, and they because they have that curiosity, right? So they actually find things more interesting in their everyday life. So some of this is, I guess, biological in a sense. I mean, I'm sure there are also environmental aspects to all of this as well. So I don't want to be lopsided, but I just find that interesting that some people enter into these things more often than others, not just from circumstance, but from some type of innate part of their personality, right? And so I found that interesting. So let's get into flow. So flow is exactly that. When you experience this sense of complete engagement in what you're doing, and you are conscious of your performance, but you are completely engaged and invested in the task itself. You are what's called absorbed. You've got high levels of absorption in what you're doing, high levels of concentration, right? You feel in control of what you're doing, and you have a clear goal you're moving towards in what you're doing. And but you forget everything else. Like, you're forgetting any problems you have in your life. You're forgetting you're forgetting about time. You have this sense of timelessness. You basically also forget to eat sometimes. So all these worries of life kind of fall away in a sense, while you're absorbed and focused on this thing that you really are engaged with. That's the idea of flow. And normally, for this to be possible, you have to have a high level of skill in something, and you have to be engaged in a challenge. They're the preconditions for flow, right? And so it is when you are using these skills that you have that are highly refined, and you were using them to meet this challenge, that you're absorbed in what you were doing, and you enter that flow state, right? And this famous psychologist, it's hard to say his name, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. So it's a pretty hard name to pronounce, but Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, he basically elaborated and pioneered a lot of this research of flow, right? And so he followed a lot of artists and followed how they were absorbed in their art, and they forget to eat, they forget to do this, but they use their high levels of skill to meet the challenge that they're trying to produce, this art or whatever they're doing in many different domains. He also studied this idea of flow in, right? Writing, all sorts of domains, even sport. This has been applied to the idea of flow. So it can be applied to many different contexts, right? But mainly it's to do with a skill that meets the demands of a challenge, right? And so artistic production is very much like that. You know, when you're like, I remember when I used to write lyrics for songs, it's the idea of, like, you know, you're in this state where you're just focusing on each little turn of phrase with the lyrics, and you're just so invested in it. You forget all time, you forget what you're doing, and you're like, holy mother, I've spent so many hours doing this. It's amazing. And so there's something about that I believe aligns with this idea of following your bliss, right? And this idea of self-actualization, because that's what follow your bliss is meant to be about. You're following your bliss so that you are actually self-actualizing, right? You're meeting your full potential. And why this concept of flow is interesting is it ties those ideas kind of together, in the sense that it's when you're at your most optimal, when you're expanding, when your skills are matching towards a task, right? You are growing and expanding your capabilities through this process. And that's why I think the flow state needs to be talked about here. So basically, there's those preconditions there for flow. And so some of these conditions are basically put forth from different researchers, are knowing what to do. So you have to have some type of task you're doing. You basically know your orientation in it. You know how to do it, so you're skilled at it. You know how well you're doing, so you're getting feedback on what you're doing, and you're adjusting according to that. So that's the challenging aspect to it, right? And you know where to go, right? And so I guess if it's a creative thing, you might not always know exactly where you're taking it, but you know that you're on a challenge to create the best thing you're creating at the very least, right? Out of this picture that you're doing, there is a definite task. You are like creating a song, or you are, making a painting, or you are doing some definite task, right? And there's a high challenge to it, right? And you're also free from other distractions. And so part of this I want to bring to you because what basically Csikszentmihalyi says, basically he does say that if the challenge is too low, right, then one gets back to flow by increasing the challenge. So if you are getting a bit bored and you have a high level of skill, you should increase the challenge in your life, and that you will enter that process of flow again. Now, if the challenge is too great for you, then you can turn back to learning your craft and learning skills. So increasing your level of skills so you can come back and meet that challenge again. So this is the whole idea of having an apprenticeship, of growing in your skills. That's why in my personal development system, I've presented a little bit of it before. I focus on having skills, knowledge, and experiences that meet the challenge of goals that's set in a project, that is set in an overall idea of a purpose, right? And so all this comes out of your values in the beginning, your personality, your strengths, and out of that you find some type of task that involves a particular skill that's specific to you and your strengths and your ideals and your specific life and your outlook on life. And you then try to build up these skills to meet these challenges and have these peak experiences, usually when you're creating something creative, right? And then out of that, you are self-actualizing. You are actually practically living out that process of what Jung said, your vocation. You are wedded to an actual vocation that is pulling you along, so to speak, because you are flowing through it. You are living through that state and you are experiencing intense joy in living this way and in creating these things, right? And so that's why I bring it to you, so you can reflect on your own life and see how this idea of flow, of skills meeting challenges and having those peak states can be introduced into your life. So you have to do some thinking around how you're going to orchestrate all these things to enter into this process so you can begin to expand your personality, expand in your vocation, in your purpose, so to speak, of who you are, right? So developing your personality and the extension of all the things that come out of who you are, right? And so I'm opening this space up for you to enter into that, and hopefully you can take away from this video lots of these principles that I've taught, and that and it takes time to learn them and understand them, but then it also takes time to explore them out in your actual life and really see them operating. And once you've done that, then you've actually had the experience of it, and now you understand the meaning and significance of these things for your psychology in your life, right? And so, so I'll end that there basically. There's some other ideas here that some people experience flow more because they have specific personality traits, which are they are more curious, they're more persistent, they have a low egotism, which means so they don't mind having little setbacks here and there because they're not so egotistic, they care. They know that that's part of the process and they keep going and persisting. And because of their persistence, they gain skill, and then and they have also a high propensity to perform activities for intrinsic reasons. That's what I was trying to get at. Specifically linked to this flow stuff, Mihai, he basically puts forth this idea that some people have a high propensity to perform activities for intrinsic reasons. So some people are more intrinsically motivated than others, and they are the types of people who enter into this flow state. And so, I can only say, if you're not intrinsically motivated, to just try to be, try to see the limits of that within yourself, right? Try to become more curious. Try to let yourself go and expand in these other ways, to be curious, to become interested, because your interest is what leads you to the spark of bliss, is what leads you to following your bliss, to find what is intrinsically enjoyable to you in your life process, right? And so that's my hope for you and out of this video. And so that kind of brings it all together, really. And I guess I'll leave it with this last kind of quote. Yeah, with this last quote from Joseph Campbell. Open quote: "If you do follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while waiting for you. And the life you ought to be living is the one you are living somehow." Close quote. So if you follow your bliss, you, according to Joseph Campbell, you somehow, it feels like you were living the life you're supposed to be. And it was like this was really your destiny. This was always here for you, this life path. So I invite you to enter into this process as best you can. Of course, we have setbacks here and there, but try to find what intrinsically motivates you. Try to find that spark of divinity in life. Try to find and follow your bliss. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.